The burden of 6 barrels. The winter air hung thick with cordite and desperation in the General Electric laboratory as Richard Gatling III hunched over blueprints that bore his great-grandfather's legacy. The year was 1960, and the prototype before him, 6 rotating barrels gleaming under fluorescent lights, represented everything the military establishment deemed impossible. A weapon that could fire 4,000 rounds per minute without melting, jamming, or destroying itself. He was just an engineer with grease under his fingernails and a 100-year-old name to vindicate. Yet the Cold War demanded miracles, and America's helicopter crews were dying in Vietnam's jungles faster than doctrine could adapt. The fluorescent bulbs buzzed overhead as Richard traced his finger along the ammunition feed mechanism. The same mechanical principle his great-grandfather had envisioned nearly a century before. But where the original Gatling gun had relied on hand cranks and brass cartridges, this miniature marvel would be electrically powered, capable of sustained fire rates that defied every assumption about small arms warfare. The strategic crisis had been building for months. Soviet-supplied forces were overwhelming American air mobility with concentrated anti-aircraft fire that traditional aircraft weapons couldn't suppress. "Another failure report, Mr. Gatling," his supervisor announced, dropping a manila folder on the workbench. "Aberdeen says the ammunition feed jammed after 90 seconds. They want to know if you're wasting government money on family nostalgia." Richard didn't look up from his calculations. The weight of institutional mockery had become familiar, almost comfortable in its predictability. Helicopter door gunners, armed with single-barrel machine guns, faced impossible odds against massed infantry attacks. Pilots returned with stories of mechanical failures under sustained fire, of weapons that seized when lives hung in the balance, of crew chiefs weeping over inadequate firepower that left their comrades exposed. The Pentagon's weapon procurement officers, steeped in decades of single-barrel orthodoxy, insisted that higher rates of fire meant catastrophic overheating and unreliability. The laboratory smelled of machine oil and burnt coffee, the chronic perfume of men working impossible hours on impossible problems. Richard's fingers found the leather-bound notebook hidden beneath technical manuals, his great-grandfather's lost journal, discovered in a Detroit estate sale 3 years prior. The metallurgical insights contained within had been impossible to realize with 1860s technology, but 1960s materials science could perfect every specification. What the military establishment couldn't understand was that some innovations require generational patience. "Sir," Richard finally replied, adjusting his thick-rimmed glasses, "the principle is sound. The failure lies in ammunition feeding, not barrel rotation. If we modify the belt linkage system and increase the drive motor torque by 15%, 15% more failure," the supervisor interrupted. "Face it, son. Your great-grandfather's moment passed with the Civil War. Modern warfare doesn't need mechanical curiosities, but Richard carried more than professional obligation. He bore the weight of family redemption. His great-grandfather's original Gatling gun had been mocked by Civil War generals who called it a mechanical curiosity until it proved its worth at Petersburg. The dismissal echoed through generations, shaping Richard's childhood poverty in post-Depression Michigan, where neighbors snickered about the Gatling boy trying to live up to his name. His father, a failed inventor, had died bitter and forgotten in a Detroit machine shop, leaving behind only whispered family stories of genius dismissed and innovation crushed by military traditionalism. At MIT, professors had called Richard's rotating barrel obsession ancestor worship. But late-night hours in the laboratory had taught him something they couldn't grasp. That vindication sometimes skips generations before finding its moment. The taste of his grandmother's coffee still lingered in memory, black and bitter, like the disappointment that had shaped his family's decline from prominence. She'd served it in chipped cups while telling stories of a grandfather whose invention could have changed warfare forever, if only small minds hadn't stood in the way. The prototype gleamed under laboratory lights, its 6 barrels arranged in perfect symmetry around the central drive mechanism. Richard's hands moved across the metal surfaces with practiced reverence, checking bearing alignment and ammunition pathways. What happened in the next 7 minutes would quietly change his understanding of everything he'd been working toward. The intercom crackled with news from Southeast Asia that would make his weapon not just possible, but desperately necessary. "Gatling, get in here," the supervisor called from his office. "Pentagon's on the phone. Something about emergency helicopter casualties and experimental weapons authorization." Richard's stomach tightened as he walked toward the office, the leather notebook still clutched in his palm. Through the window, he could see the Michigan winter landscape stretching toward distant factories, where his father had once dreamed of mechanical greatness. The Cold War had indeed demanded miracles, but miracles always carried prices that inventors couldn't foresee when they first put pencil to paper and dared to imagine what others called impossible. If stories like this make you question what you'd do in someone else's boots, tell us in the comments how you imagine you'd react in this camp, and stay with us for the next chapters. How do you honor a legacy that others dismiss as obsolete, while knowing the world may desperately need exactly what your family once created? The Pentagon's emergency authorization arrived on a Tuesday morning in February 1961, stamped with classifications Richard had never seen, and signed by generals whose names appeared in newspaper headlines about Southeast Asian escalation. Colonel John Stoner's voice crackled through the secure telephone line from Washington, carrying the controlled urgency of a man who'd seen too many helicopter crews limping home from missions they shouldn't have survived. "Mr. Gatling, we have 47 helicopter casualties in the past month," the colonel explained. "Door gunners with single-barrel weapons facing coordinated ground fire they can't suppress. Your rotating barrel concept isn't experimental anymore. It's a lifeline we need yesterday." Richard's fingers traced the edge of his great-grandfather's notebook while absorbing the weight of sudden relevance. For 3 years, he'd endured ridicule and budget cuts, working 18-hour days in General Electric's classified weapons division, calculating barrel rotation speeds and heat dissipation rates that defied conventional wisdom. His wife had left him 6 months earlier, unable to compete with blueprints and prototypes that consumed his every waking thought. Colleagues avoided him at company gatherings, convinced his project represented career suicide for anyone associated with Gatling's folly. But the strategic crisis had reached levels that made yesterday's impossibilities into today's urgent necessities. Soviet-supplied forces were overwhelming American air mobility with concentrated anti-aircraft fire that turned routine supply missions into desperate fighting withdrawals. Traditional military doctrine had no answer for massed infantry attacks against isolated landing zones, where helicopter door gunners faced impossible odds with weapons designed for different wars. "Colonel, I need to be honest about the development timeline," Richard replied, watching February snow accumulate outside the laboratory windows. "The first prototype exploded during testing last month. We nearly lost 2 technicians, and military observers wrote dismissive reports about another Gatling fantasy. Tell me about the explosion." Richard closed his eyes, remembering the sharp crack of metal failure and the shower of shrapnel that had cleared the testing range in seconds. The barrel alignment was perfect until the final moment. The rotation principle worked exactly as designed. The failure came from ammunition-feeding mechanisms that couldn't maintain synchronization under sustained fire rates. "Can you fix it?" The question hung in laboratory air, thick with machine oil and the chronic coffee smell that marked long nights of iterative engineering. Richard opened his great-grandfather's notebook to a page filled with mechanical sketches and metallurgical calculations that 1860s technology couldn't realize. The handwriting looked like his own, separated by a century of family disappointment and vindication deferred. "Sir, I believe so. The principle is sound, but we need to completely redesign the belt linkage system and upgrade the drive motor specifications. Give me 8 weeks, and I'll have a weapon that can clear entire landing zones. What Richard couldn't tell the colonel was how the project had already destroyed everything else in his life. His marriage had ended in a Detroit courthouse, where his wife testified about competing with blueprints for her husband's attention. His father's death in a machine shop had taught him that innovation without recognition was just another form of failure. Childhood poverty in post-Depression Michigan had been shaped by neighbors who snickered about the Gatling boy trying to live up to his name, making brilliance feel like a family curse rather than a gift. But military necessity had a way of transforming curses into urgent requirements. Reports filtered back from Vietnam's jungles about helicopter crews facing concentrated fire from prepared positions, about door gunners weeping over inadequate firepower that left their comrades exposed during critical extractions. The Pentagon's weapon procurement officers, steeped in decades of single-barrel orthodoxy, suddenly found their fundamental assumptions challenged by battlefield realities that demanded mechanical solutions their doctrine couldn't provide. Richard spent the following weeks rebuilding everything from barrel housing to ammunition pathways, working with materials scientists who'd previously considered his project an elaborate waste of research funding. The laboratory became his entire world, fluorescent lights marking time while winter gave way to early spring. Outside windows he rarely looked through. His great-grandfather's notebook provided guidance for challenges that conventional engineering couldn't solve. Heat dissipation patterns and rotation timing that required insight spanning generations of mechanical innovation. The breakthrough came during a pre-dawn testing session when the modified prototype achieved sustained fire rates that made hardened weapons testers step back in genuine awe. The sound was unlike anything produced by conventional weapons, a continuous mechanical roar that transformed individual cartridges into an unbroken stream of suppression fire. For 17 minutes, the minigun functioned exactly as Richard had envisioned, its 6 barrels rotating with perfect synchronization while ammunition fed through redesigned linkages that never faltered. But success brought unexpected resistance from corners Richard hadn't anticipated. Senior officers whose careers were built on traditional small arms doctrine began questioning whether such overwhelming firepower represented tactical advancement or dangerous escalation. They argued that weapons requiring electrical power couldn't be trusted in infantry combat, that logistics networks couldn't supply adequate ammunition, that firepower dominance might create more conflicts than it resolved. "The weapon works too well," one general privately admitted after classified trials at Aberdeen Proving Ground. "It makes existing inventory obsolete and exposes decades of procurement decisions that suddenly look like expensive mistakes." The taste of vindication carried unexpected bitterness, like his grandmother's coffee served in chipped cups while she told stories of genius dismissed and innovation crushed by institutional fear. Richard had proven that 19th century principles could be reborn through 20th century engineering, but victory felt hollow when measured against the resistance of men who preferred familiar failures to unfamiliar success. What would it mean to see your life's work finally recognized, only to discover that recognition came with moral weight you'd never anticipated? Spring arrived in Michigan with news from Vietnam that changed everything. Colonel Stoner's reports painted a picture of helicopter crews facing impossible tactical situations, isolated landing zones where single-barrel door guns couldn't suppress concentrated ground fire, extraction missions that became desperate fighting retreats, and casualty rates that threatened to ground American air mobility operations entirely. The minigun's first combat deployment in May 1962 would prove transformational in ways Richard had never imagined. "We mounted your weapon system on 3 UH-1 helicopters last week," Stoner reported during their weekly conference call. Door gunners who previously fought hopeless suppression battles against massed infantry suddenly possessed firepower that could clear entire landing zones. Enemy positions that had pinned down our aircraft for hours simply ceased firing when the minigun opened up. Richard listened while staring at his great-grandfather's notebook, open to a page where century-old handwriting described mechanical principles that had finally found their moment in history. The laboratory felt different now, no longer a refuge from institutional mockery, but a place where theoretical innovation had become operational reality. Yet the weight of transformation carried unexpected emotional complexity that kept him awake during Michigan's warming nights. Letters began arriving from helicopter crews stationed throughout Southeast Asia, handwritten testimonials that mixed gratitude with details that chilled Richard to his core. One door gunner described watching his minigun's fire effects with clinical detachment that seemed to distance him from what he was seeing. Another crew chief wrote about landing zones that had been cleared so thoroughly that recovery teams found no signs of organized resistance, only silence that felt heavier than the original gunfire. "Sir, the weapon performs exactly as designed," one pilot reported. "But it's changing how we approach every mission. Previous generations would have used maneuvering and tactical patience. Now we rely on firepower dominance to solve problems that might have been approached through different methods." Richard's wife had left him during the previous winter, unable to compete with blueprints and prototypes that consumed his every waking thought. Their final argument had taken place in this same laboratory, surrounded by technical manuals and ammunition feed mechanisms that represented his family's century-long quest for vindication. She'd accused him of loving dead ancestors more than living people, of choosing mechanical precision over human connection. "You're not bringing back your great-grandfather," she'd said, while packing her belongings. "You're just creating new ways for people to be hurt." Her words echoed now as reports filtered back from combat zones where his precisely engineered weapon was changing fundamental approaches to air-ground warfare. The minigun's effectiveness created tactical doctrines that relied increasingly on mechanical superiority rather than strategic wisdom. Conflicts that previous generations would have approached through negotiation or careful maneuvering were now being resolved through overwhelming firepower that left no room for alternative solutions. But institutional vindication came with ironies that Richard's family stories had never prepared him for. Pentagon officials who had publicly ridiculed Gatling's folly suddenly claimed credit for supporting innovative research. Defense contractors who had refused to bid on impossible prototypes demanded immediate production licenses. Military historians began rewriting procurement narratives to minimize the resistance Richard had faced, transforming years of mockery into examples of far-sighted developmental patience. The most bitter twist came during a defense conference in Washington, where the same generals who had buried his test results appeared on panels describing the minigun as vindication of their forward-thinking weapons development philosophy. Richard sat in the audience, watching men who had called his project ancestor worship receive commendations for recognizing revolutionary potential in rotating barrel technology. The Gatling minigun represents exactly the kind of innovative thinking our procurement system encourages, one general announced to applause from defense contractors and military analysts. "We've always supported unconventional approaches to tactical challenges." Richard's childhood memories of Detroit poverty suddenly felt like preparation for this moment, neighbors snickering about the Gatling boy trying to live up to his name, while his father died bitter and forgotten in a machine shop, leaving behind only whispered family stories of genius dismissed by small minds. The taste of his grandmother's coffee lingered in memory, black and bitter like the disappointment that had shaped his family's decline from prominence. Yet letters continued arriving from helicopter crews whose lives his weapon had saved, mixing gratitude with questions that kept Richard awake during increasingly restless nights. One pilot wrote about wondering whether such overwhelming firepower made conflicts more likely rather than more decisive. A door gunner described feeling responsible for changes in how wars were fought, as if individual innovations carried moral weight that inventors couldn't foresee when they first put pencil to paper. The Michigan spring felt different now, not just seasonal change, but historical transformation that would echo far beyond laboratory walls, where his great-grandfather's notebook lay open to pages of mechanical insights that had finally found their deadly application. Richard had proven that individual genius could overcome institutional resistance, but victory carried consequences that vindication alone couldn't resolve. Do you think you'd cling to what you were taught back home, or to what your own eyes see in a place like this? Comment which side you'd lean toward, and share this episode with someone who loves real human stories from history. How do you carry the weight of creating something that saves lives and changes warfare simultaneously? By autumn 1962, the minigun had become standard equipment on helicopter operations throughout Southeast Asia. But Richard found himself increasingly haunted by letters that described the weapon's effects in language that chilled him. A young door gunner from Ohio wrote about watching his fire-clear enemy positions with efficiency that left no time for moral reflection. Another crew member described landing zones that had been so thoroughly suppressed that recovery teams walked through areas where organized resistance had simply ceased to exist. "Mr. Gatling, we need to discuss production scaling," his supervisor announced during a late October meeting. Pentagon wants 500 units by Christmas, with full manufacturing licenses for 3 major contractors. Richard stared through laboratory windows at Michigan's changing leaves, remembering autumn afternoons from his childhood when his grandmother would tell stories of his great-grandfather's original gun being mocked by Civil War generals until it proved its worth at Petersburg. The irony of institutional memory felt particularly sharp. How quickly dismissal transformed into desperate demand when battlefield necessity made yesterday's impossibilities into today's urgent requirements. The transformation had consumed everything else in his life. His empty house in suburban Detroit echoed with silence that blueprints and prototypes couldn't fill. Colleagues who had once avoided him at company gatherings now sought his opinion on weapons development projects that would have seemed fantastical just months earlier. The taste of vindication carried unexpected bitterness, like his grandmother's coffee served, while she described genius dismissed and innovation crushed by minds too small to recognize revolutionary potential. But letters from combat zones painted pictures that technical specifications couldn't capture. One helicopter crew described a mission where their minigun's suppression fire had been so overwhelming that enemy positions simply went silent, leaving them to wonder whether tactical success had come at costs they couldn't measure. Another pilot wrote about feeling responsible for changes in how conflicts were approached, as if mechanical innovation carried moral weight that extended far beyond the laboratory where theoretical principles became operational reality. "Sir, I've been thinking about the weapon's long-term implications," Richard told Colonel Stoner during one of their weekly calls. "Reports suggest we're not just changing tactical approaches, we're fundamentally altering how air-ground combat is conceived and executed. Are you having second thoughts about your invention?" Richard opened his great-grandfather's notebook to a page filled with metallurgical calculations that 1860s technology couldn't realize. The handwriting looked like his own, separated by a century of family disappointment and vindication deferred. "I'm wondering if there's a difference between solving immediate tactical problems and creating systemic changes in how wars are fought." The question lingered in laboratory air, thick with machine oil and the chronic coffee smell that marked long nights of iterative engineering. Richard had achieved everything his family's century-long quest for vindication had imagined: institutional recognition, military adoption, and proof that individual genius could overcome bureaucratic resistance. Yet success felt hollow when measured against letters from crews who described the weapon's effects with clinical detachment that seemed to distance them from what they were witnessing. Production scaling meant working with defense contractors who had previously refused to bid on impossible prototypes, but now demanded immediate manufacturing licenses. The same companies that had dismissed rotating barrel technology as impractical suddenly discovered urgent commercial interest in mechanical principles they'd considered obsolete. Richard found himself attending meetings where men discussed ammunition requirements and profit margins, while his weapon redefined sustained fire exactly as he'd intended. But the minigun's effectiveness created tactical doctrines that relied increasingly on mechanical superiority rather than strategic wisdom. Battlefield reports described conflicts being resolved through firepower dominance that previous generations would have approached through careful positioning and patient maneuvering. The weapon Richard had designed to save American lives was changing fundamental assumptions about how military problems could be solved, making overwhelming force seem like the natural solution to complex tactical challenges. Dr. Sarah Mitchell, a military psychologist who had begun studying the weapon's impact on crew performance, visited the laboratory in November with questions that Richard had been avoiding. "Your invention appears to be affecting not just tactical outcomes, but the psychological relationship between operators and their targets," she explained. "Crews report feeling disconnected from the consequences of such concentrated firepower." "Is that necessarily problematic?" Richard asked, though he suspected he already knew her answer. "We're seeing behavioral changes that suggest the weapon's efficiency may be creating emotional distance between human operators and human consequences. When suppression becomes so overwhelming that resistance simply ceases, crews lose the tactical feedback that helps them maintain awareness of what they're accomplishing." Richard's fingers traced the edge of his great-grandfather's notebook while processing implications he'd never considered during those 18-hour days of developmental work. The minigun had solved every technical challenge he'd set out to address: sustained fire rates, heat management, ammunition feeding, and electrical reliability. But technical success had generated moral complexity that vindication alone couldn't resolve. Michigan's autumn felt different now, not just seasonal change, but historical transformation that would echo far beyond laboratory walls, where theoretical innovation had become operational reality. Richard had proven that 19th-century genius could be reborn through 20th-century engineering, but victory carried consequences that his family stories of dismissed innovation had never prepared him to handle. What price do you pay when your life's work succeeds beyond every expectation, but changes more than you intended? The classified report arrived in December 1962, stamped with security clearances Richard had never seen, and containing information that would fundamentally change how he understood his own creation. Colonel Stoner's cover letter was brief, but carried weight that settled into Richard's chest like cold Michigan winter air. The minigun's combat effectiveness was creating strategic implications that extended far beyond tactical helicopter support. "Mr. Gatling, I need you to read this carefully," Stoner said during their secure phone call. "What you're about to learn doesn't leave that laboratory, but you deserve to understand what your weapon has become." Richard opened the folder to find battlefield analyses that described systematic changes in how ground forces approached American air operations. Enemy tactics were evolving in response to the minigun's overwhelming suppression capability. Scattered positioning, rapid movement, and abandonment of concentrated defensive positions that had previously been effective against single-barrel door guns. His weapon wasn't just solving tactical problems. It was forcing strategic adaptations that rippled through entire campaign approaches. But the report's most sobering section detailed psychological assessments of helicopter crews who had operated miniguns during extended combat deployments. Dr. Mitchell's preliminary findings described behavioral patterns that suggested the weapon's efficiency was creating emotional distance between operators and consequences. Crews reported feeling mechanically detached from suppression effects that were too overwhelming to process in human terms. One door gunner described it like operating industrial equipment rather than engaging human targets, the report noted. The weapon's sustained fire rate creates sensory experiences that operators process differently than traditional small arms engagement. They're seeing tactical results without the psychological feedback that helps maintain awareness of what they're accomplishing. Richard set down the papers and walked to his laboratory window, staring at December snow that reminded him of childhood winters, when his grandmother would serve bitter coffee and tell stories of genius dismissed and innovation crushed by minds too small to recognize revolutionary potential. The irony felt particularly sharp now. His great-grandfather's rotating barrel principle had finally achieved recognition, but success carried moral complexity that family stories had never prepared him to handle. The central revelation came buried in technical appendices that described ammunition expenditure rates during typical suppression missions. Miniguns consumed rounds at such unprecedented volumes that logistics planners were redesigning entire supply chains to support sustained operations. One helicopter crew could expend more ammunition during a single mission than an infantry company would use in a week of conventional combat. The weapon Richard had designed to save American lives was transforming fundamental assumptions about how wars could be supplied and sustained. "Sir, we need to discuss something that isn't in any official reports," Stoner continued. "Your weapon has become politically sensitive at levels that extend beyond military procurement. State Department analysts are expressing concerns about escalation implications if this technology becomes standard throughout American military operations." Richard's fingers found his great-grandfather's notebook, opening to pages where century-old handwriting described mechanical principles that had finally found their deadly application. The leather binding felt warm against his palm, carrying the weight of generational dreams that had achieved vindication through methods his ancestors couldn't have imagined. "Colonel, are you suggesting the minigun's effectiveness has become strategically problematic?" "I'm saying that overwhelming firepower capabilities change how conflicts develop and resolve. Your weapon doesn't just suppress enemy positions, it eliminates them so thoroughly that diplomatic alternatives become academic rather than practical considerations." The implication settled over Richard like winter chill that penetrated laboratory walls, despite heating systems that hummed constantly through Michigan's coldest months. He had achieved everything his family's century-long quest for recognition had imagined: institutional adoption, military necessity, and proof that individual genius could overcome bureaucratic resistance. Yet success felt hollow when measured against consequences that technical specifications couldn't capture. Letters from helicopter crews continued arriving, but their tone had shifted subtly from gratitude toward something more complex that Richard struggled to identify. One pilot wrote about wondering whether tactical problems might have alternative solutions that didn't require such overwhelming mechanical responses. A door gunner described feeling responsible for changes in how conflicts were approached, as if individual innovations carried moral weight that inventors couldn't foresee when they first put pencil to paper and dared to imagine what others called impossible. The minigun's rotation mechanism gleamed under laboratory lights, its 6 barrels arranged in perfect symmetry around the central drive system that had consumed Richard's life for 3 years of 18-hour developmental days. The weapon functioned exactly as designed: sustained fire rates that could clear entire landing zones, ammunition feeding that never faltered, and electrical reliability that helicopter crews trusted with their lives. Technical success was complete and undeniable. But Dr. Mitchell's psychological assessments described behavioral changes that suggested efficiency itself had become problematic. When suppression became so overwhelming that resistance simply ceased, Operators lost tactical feedback that helped them maintain emotional connection to what they were accomplishing. The minigun's effectiveness created sensory experiences that crews processed differently than traditional combat engagement, leading to mechanical detachment that concerned military psychologists studying long-term operational impacts. Richard closed the classified report and walked through his empty laboratory, past workbenches where theoretical innovation had become operational reality that was transforming how wars were fought across the globe. His great-grandfather's mechanical principles had finally achieved the recognition that family stories claimed they'd always deserved. But vindication carried complexity that generations of dismissed genius had never anticipated. The winter air held the taste of machine oil and burnt coffee, chronic perfumes that marked endless nights of engineering refinement, guided by century-old insights that 1960s materials science could finally realize. Richard had proven that individual brilliance could overcome institutional resistance, but victory felt bittersweet when measured against letters from crews who questioned whether such overwhelming firepower made conflicts more likely rather than more decisive. How do you process the realization that your greatest achievement might have consequences extending far beyond what you intended? 25 years later, Richard Gatling III sat in his workshop behind the house in suburban Detroit, surrounded by mechanical sketches for weapons he hoped would never be needed. The minigun had endured in armories worldwide, but its true legacy lay deeper, in proof that individual genius could overcome institutional resistance, and in the reminder that every innovation carries consequences its creator cannot fully foresee. The taste of his grandmother's coffee lingered in memory whenever someone said the word enemy, bitter and complex, like the vindication that had defined his life's work. The letters still arrived occasionally, now from veterans of conflicts that had spread far beyond Vietnam's jungles, where the rotating barrel principle had first proven its devastating effectiveness. Former helicopter crews wrote with perspectives that decades of civilian life had clarified, gratitude mixed with questions about warfare's transformation toward mechanical dominance over strategic patience. One door gunner, now a grandfather himself, described still hearing the minigun's continuous roar during quiet moments when memory refused to stay buried. "Mr. Gatling," the young journalist asked during what would be his final interview, "do you have any regrets about creating a weapon that changed how wars are fought?" Richard traced his finger along the edge of his great-grandfather's notebook, its leather binding worn smooth by 70 years of handling. Through workshop windows, he could see Detroit's industrial landscape where his father had died bitter and forgotten in a machine shop, leaving behind only whispered family stories of genius dismissed and innovation crushed by minds too small to recognize revolutionary potential. The irony of institutional memory remained sharp. How quickly dismissal transformed into desperate adoption when necessity made yesterday's impossibilities into today's urgent requirements. "Regret suggests I would make different choices with the same information," Richard replied. "But I had different information then. I saw helicopter crews dying because their weapons couldn't suppress concentrated ground fire. I saw tactical problems that rotating barrel technology could solve. What I didn't see was how solving immediate problems would create systemic changes in how conflicts are approached." The journalist's questions reflected public fascination with weapons development that had grown throughout decades when technological innovation increasingly shaped military capabilities. Richard's minigun had become symbolic of broader transformation toward mechanical solutions for strategic challenges that previous generations might have approached through negotiation or careful diplomatic positioning. The weapon's effectiveness had made overwhelming firepower seem like the natural response to complex, tactical situations. But the cost of vindication had been measured in ways that family stories of dismissed innovation had never prepared him to handle. His marriage had ended during those 18-hour developmental days when blueprints and prototypes consumed every waking thought. Colleagues who had once avoided him at company gatherings eventually sought his opinion on projects that would have seemed fantastical before the minigun proved that theoretical principles could become operational reality through sufficient engineering persistence. The Pentagon's eventual embrace had exposed institutional hypocrisies that Richard hadn't anticipated. Officers who had publicly dismissed rotating barrel weapons suddenly claimed credit for supporting innovative research. Defense contractors who had refused to bid on impossible prototypes demanded manufacturing licenses for technology they'd previously considered obsolete. Military historians rewrote procurement narratives to minimize the resistance Richard had faced, transforming years of mockery into examples of far-sighted developmental patience. The weapon endured because it solved real problems, Richard explained to the journalist. Door gunners needed sustained fire capability that single-barrel weapons couldn't provide. Helicopter crews required suppression systems reliable enough to trust with their lives. The minigun delivered technical performance that exceeded every specification we'd established. Yet success had carried moral complexity that technical specifications couldn't capture. Dr. Mitchell's psychological studies, now declassified and published in military journals, described behavioral changes among crews who operated weapons so efficient that resistance simply ceased rather than being gradually overcome. The minigun's overwhelming effectiveness created sensory experiences that operators processed differently than traditional combat engagement, leading to mechanical detachment that concerned psychologists studying long-term impacts. Richard stood from his workbench and walked to a filing cabinet where he kept letters from veterans whose lives his weapon had saved, and from others who questioned whether such overwhelming firepower made conflicts more likely rather than more decisive. One pilot had written about wondering if tactical problems might have alternative solutions that didn't require mechanical dominance over human calculation. A crew chief described feeling responsible for changes in how wars were fought, as if individual innovations carried weight that inventors couldn't foresee when they first dared to imagine what others called impossible. The workshop held the same smells that had marked his laboratory during those crucial developmental months: machine oil and burnt coffee, chronic perfumes of long nights guided by century-old insights that 1960s materials science could finally realize. His great-grandfather's mechanical principles had achieved recognition that family stories claimed they'd always deserved. But vindication had transformed not just military capabilities, but fundamental approaches to conflict resolution through overwhelming technical superiority. "Young man," Richard said as the interview concluded, "people ask if I'm proud of creating the minigun. Pride suggests satisfaction with outcomes that were entirely predictable. What I feel is more complex: gratitude that my work saved American lives, responsibility for changes I didn't anticipate, and awareness that innovation always carries consequences extending beyond what inventors can foresee when they're solving immediate problems." The journalist packed his recording equipment while December snow accumulated outside workshop windows that framed Detroit's industrial landscape, where 3 generations of Gatling men had pursued mechanical excellence through different approaches to the same fundamental challenge, proving that individual brilliance could overcome institutional resistance. Richard had succeeded where his father and great-grandfather had fallen short, but success carried weight that vindication alone couldn't resolve. In his final years, Richard rarely spoke publicly about his creation, but the minigun's legacy endured in armories worldwide and in the quiet knowledge that hatred was easier to carry than the memory of kindness that even weapons could represent. Kindness to crews whose lives depended on reliable firepower. Kindness to a nation whose tactical challenges demanded innovative solutions. And the complex kindness of achieving family vindication through methods that changed how wars are fought across the globe. The workshop grew quiet, except for winter wind that reminded him of Michigan evenings when his grandmother would serve bitter coffee and tell stories of genius dismissed by minds too small to recognize revolutionary potential. Richard had proven those stories wrong through persistence and engineering excellence, but proof carried the taste of machine oil and moral complexity that would linger in memory long after the last minigun fell silent in conflicts he'd never imagined when he first opened his great-grandfather's notebook and dared to believe that some innovations require generational patience before finding their moment in history. If this story reminded you that even in the darkest times, small acts of humanity still matter, subscribe to the channel. Tell us which country you watch from, and invite someone to revisit history with us in the next story. What legacy would you want to leave? One that solved immediate problems, or one that considered long-term consequences you couldn't predict?